So welcome to reflection number two. I just played the first reflection and listened to myself. It was a little bit difficult for me, uh, but I think the file worked. I have to figure out how to load them, and I haven't sorted that out yet. But I'm going into the second reflection because I don't want to spend the next hour getting frustrated about loading the files. So let's start with chapter two. And I noticed something in watching myself. I used to, as a child, a little boy, I should say. I want to be precise because this is a story of cruelty, uh, childhood cruelty. I had a grandmother who had a palsy, and it caused her head to shake. And we always used to sit over in the corner and we'd imitate her without her knowing, and we would giggle and laugh. Of course, it was cruel. My grandmother was a very powerful figure, and she would never have tolerated it. But we were over in the corner hiding away from her. And what I've noticed, karma is a feature of reality, because guess what? I have the condition she had. So, so if you see my head bouncing around, uh, that's the reason. The palsy has a name. I'm not sure what it is. But in any case, I think it's only just that I now face this myself, watching the bobbing head. That aside, just a personal note, neither here nor there. Let's get started on chapter two, critical perspectives as interpretive frameworks. The general concern I think that Dugan has here is his general concern is to have us cultivate a sense of what it means to adopt a critical perspective. So it is an important perspective to adopt. So we'll talk about it. I noted in the last reflection, I referenced Dugan, his statement that we need to let go of certainty. There's a great deal of truth to that. We do need to let go of certainty. He's quite right. And we have discussed that in a little bit of detail, right? About how the crises we face now are generating a world that's shifting and twisting and turning and bending. The world's becoming much less predictable and regular. So I made that point in reflection one, and it dangles behind chapter two. So we need to keep it in mind. Now, he adopts an approach called critical social theory. And critical social theory is one of the paradigms he mentions in chapter one when he mentions the research paradigms. I'm just trying to look it up here. Yeah, that's what he talks about. Critical theory is what he discusses under those four paradigms. And here it is again in the context of critical social theory. So, what is it? I'm going to cite his, he cites Levinson in order to provide a kind of definition of critical social theory. And I'm going to read that out because I think it's important for us to have some clear representation of what we're talking about. And I think this gets us close to it. Critical social theories, and here's the quote, offer conceptual accounts. This is on page 31, by the way, if you're looking for it. Offer conceptual accounts of the social world that attempt to understand and explain the causes of structural domination, note the term structural there, and inequality in order to facilitate human emancipation and equity, where equity is not equality, equity is fairness. Equity and equality are two terms that are often regarded as interchangeable. but they are by no means interchangeable and should not be interchanged. They're very different notions. And we might touch on that in the course of time. I have no doubt we'll be touching on the notion of equity. So again, here we have a kind of picture of what critical social theory is. So let's reflect on it. We're looking at something, I mentioned the term structural. So when we talk about domination or inequality, we're not talking about phenomena that occur and then vanish, that are impermanent or transitory. These are structural realities. And that means they're embedded within the very foundations of the social order, how we organize ourselves in society. So if you look, for example, a common example of this would be racism. People will argue that racism is structural. What does that mean? That means it's not just a phenomenon that you measure with respect to individuals and the behavior of individuals. X is racist, Y is racist. There are racists in our world. There's no doubt about it. There are such X's and Y's. But the claim to structural racism is a different claim. And it goes into the institutional infrastructure of modern society. The claim that is that racism is somehow embedded in the very institutional structures that we've established to manage our societies, our communities. And if you know the literature on critical race theory, for example, there are countless examples of structural racism. You can see it. It's not that difficult to find. So this would be part of critical social theory, right? So you're looking at society from a critical perspective, and it's important to keep in mind you have a moral perspective. So critical theory is, and Dugan talks about this in chapter 2, critical theory is what he calls value-laden, meaning it is connected to I hesitate to call it a moral crusade. That's not the right term. It's connected to emancipation, to human emancipation. So the idea, this goes back to Karl Marx. Karl Marx had said, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The time has come to change it. And there is something to that. We're talking about transformation in this course, and transformation is a big case of change. And what Marx had in mind, not that we have to talk about his thinking, but what Marx had in mind was also a transformation. So Marx was not interested in reform. Marx was interested in transformation. We'll come to another thinker today when we come to ideology and hegemony, Gramsci, who's a Marxist thinker and shares a number of the central views of Marx. Marx is an important person in critical theory, if only because Marx is the principal classical opponent of capitalism. So no surprises there. Dugan talks in the preface of his book about how if you talk about leadership and you go to topics like Karl Marx or Gramsci, once people know who Gramsci is, and I'll tell you who he was, people want to get up and walk out of the room. This speaks, believe it or not, to the topic of ideology, and we'll get there in a moment. First, however, I want to discuss the different components or parts of what Dugan calls central themes of critical social theory. He has three of them. And if I'm not mistaken, and the first is stocks of knowledge. And I don't think stocks of knowledge is difficult to sort out. We all have stocks of knowledge. We're all walking around with stocks of knowledge in our head. Well, what is a stock of knowledge? It's my own personal collection of thoughts, beliefs, opinions, surmises, conjectures about the world. Often tacit in nature. This is not explicit knowledge. We're often not even aware of it ourselves. If you know the work of someone like Daniel Kahneman, he talks about implicit bias, various types of judgments we make about others, for example, that we're not even aware we're making. And believe it or not, the topics of hegemony and ideology will take us there, because hegemony is something that happens behind explicit consciousness, explicit awareness, and I'll get to that. So it's a fascinating idea. So stocks of knowledge, if you have any questions about it, let me know. But I think that's where Dugan is going. He's looking at the private stock of implicit knowledge we all carry around. We all interpret the world under our own personal categories, which we've acquired through our own unique experiences. It's a marvel, if you think about this for a minute or two, that we're capable of communicating ideas to one another. It's fascinating if you think about it, but I'm going to let that go because our experience is unique. And it shapes a unique set of beliefs and opinions. And yet we're able to communicate. So that's just a bit of a philosophical note. Now, let me turn, and it might be the right time to turn, to the topics of ideology and hegemony. Now, these are complex ideas. So if you have a clear understanding of them, you're unique, because you should stand up and be counted. Because I'm not convinced anyone has a clear, perspicuous conception of either one of these terms, ideology or hegemony. I'm going to give you my take on them, and a grain of salt here, because I recognize whatever I say about them would require some elaboration and clarification. And I'm quite happy to do that in conversation with you, either in our joint collaborative sessions or through email or some other medium. Now, ideology, let me turn to ideology for a moment. I think the best way to position the idea of ideology is this. If you look, it's a notion that comes out of Marx and Engels, and the idea is this: the ruling class, and we do, our society for Marx is a class society. You have an upper class, a middle class, a lower class. That's not an unusual way to conceive of society, is based on classes. And it's not an idea attributable to Karl Marx. It goes right back to Adam Smith, the father of capitalism. So Smith himself and Ricardo, who was the economist who followed Smith, they both had a class analysis of society. That did not come with Marx, that came with his predecessors. He elaborated it and enriched it. The reason we're talking about class here is ideology is related to the ruling class. And to simplify it, and I'm taking a risk here, whenever you simplify something, you leave out considerations that ought to be brought in. But this is the way I would simplify. You have a ruling class, and the ruling class has an option. Every ruling class has an option. When people get out of hand, and they will, because you're the ruler, they're the ruled, things might not go well for them. Maybe you're trying to take too much of their corn, if you're a medieval landlord and they're beginning to starve or what have you. They get out of hand. So an ideology arises in the modern period. So with, for example, mass communication, newspaper, you have to remember, newspapers are 300 years old. They're not very old. So you have, with the rise of industrial society, you have these mass media, and the ruling class, in effect, uses the mass media to control the ruled. So the ruler controls the ruled through ideology. Here's the other option. There are other options, of course. You can beat up on the ruled. To get out of hand, you send the police out or the army and you beat them up. But that's not a very convenient or successful approach for the ruling class to govern the ruled. It would be much easier, and is much easier, if you can control people from within their own minds. Now, I know that sounds very peculiar, but an ideology is, and I'm about to give you a specific example, an ideology is a picture of the world that the ruling class uses in order to subjugate the ruled and to keep them subordinate and subaltern, to use a term from Gramsci, so that they remain the ruled and they're protected. The ruling class is thereby protected from those they rule without imposing violence. Although if you know the history of even Western democracies, the appeal to violence is not that uncommon. So when the citizenry gets out of hand, at times the ruling class will call out the army. That happens. But it's much better to develop a whole set of beliefs that you can ask people to adopt and encourage them to adopt, that shape their thinking in such a way that they see their subordination and subjugation as natural. It's somehow justified. It's the way things are and always have been and always will be. Let me give you specific examples. I know this can be a bit hard to follow. I want to go to Adam Smith, and he's the foremost theoretician of modern capitalism. So if you read The Wealth of Nations, everyone will tell you, oh, this is the birth of the capitalist ethos, right? It's in Smith, and it is in Adam Smith. But Smith does a very interesting thing. In The Wealth of Nations, he says, by nature, we, you and I, all of us human beings, we truck, barter, we exchange. And that means we're always seeking to sell, to buy, to sell, to buy, to exchange. We're always looking after our own interests. And in a very specific way, we look to enhance our own interests through advantages that arise in exchange. So it's all about exchanging within a social order, within an economy. Now, what we have to recognize is prior to the rise of modern capitalism, there was no exchange. There was no exchange commodity. Economy in that sense. There was no exchange economy, not in the medieval period. The exchange economy arises with mass production. So my point here is that Smith, in order to bring us to the point where we accept the capitalist order as natural, not social, not something we've created together, not a creature of law or of history. Rather, capitalism reflects our inner nature. We are by nature inclined to buy and sell, buy and sell, buy and sell. So the whole idea of commodification, of a world of commodities and markets, that are exchanged around the world, that idea is the idea that it stems from our inner nature to behave this way is an ideology, right? And many people accept that ideology. If you look, for example, we go on and on about inequality. Oh, gross inequality. Jeff Bezos has billions and I have, a few thousand, whatever. And we all know, yeah, inequality is out of control. But why are we so complacent? Why do we accept that the 1% live like kings and the bottom 50% struggle to pay their rent? Why would we ever accept that kind of economy? Why would you ever accept an economy in which very few people own the means of production and everyone else works for the people who own the means of production? Because it's pretty clear that will create, on the one hand, a small minority, and on the other hand, an enormous majority. And there will be a divide between those who own and those who do not own. And that's one of the most fundamental characteristics of modern society. It's the distinction between those who own and those who have to work for a living. They can't live off of the proceeds of their assets, right? They have to work. So all of this is by way of saying capitalism, and Dugan talks about this under, he has a diagram with the term commodification in it. It's the wrong term. He's talking about capitalism, not commodification, but I think he's paying attention to his preface. He doesn't want you all to leave the room because he's talking about Karl Marx. Now, Marx, just to finish on Marx, Marx was a fascinating and very important thinker. That doesn't mean he was right in all respects or anything of that sort, but he's a wealth of ideas and thoughts, and important ones. So much for ideology. Now on hegemony, a related term. This again is a simplification, but it's a nice way of expressing it, in my opinion. If you understand what an ideology is a set of ideas that are meant to justify the control of the many by the few, right? To see that control as a manifestation of a natural process, not a social or political one, right? Capitalism, this is another way to look at ideology. Most diehard capitalists don't see it as a product of history at all. They don't see it as a social construction at all. It reflects nature, our nature. They believe what Smith said. We are by nature capitalists. We're kind of born capitalists. How? Well, we all have to buy and sell, and that's all we do is buy and sell. That's kind of our principal activity. This takes us to the topic of consumerism. But in any case, there's an ideology. When the ideology, which is outside of my mind, created by a ruling class, right? When that ideology enters my head and I adopt it as my own frame of thinking, that is hegemony. Why? Because I'm no longer faced with a ruling class with an ideology outside of myself, right? It's there, the ideology. But as a hegemony, that ideology becomes hegemonic when it enters my thinking and shapes my thinking and becomes the frame for my thinking. So people have asked, social theorists have asked for years, why is it that the oppressed minority, if we can use that term, or the oppressed majority, right, those who are ruled, David Hume, the philosopher, raised this question. Why do the many, given their obvious power, why do the many accept the rule of the few? This goes right back to Plato. It's a very old political question. Why do we accept the ruling class? Why do we accept a ruling class, right? Well, we accept it, and this is what I think Gramsci says, we accept it because the ideology of the ruling class becomes our own frame for thinking. In other words, we adopt the perspective of our oppressors, which, if you think about it, is fascinating. But I think that is what stands behind the notion of hegemony. So again, for ideology, you have a ruling class that articulates a theory that somehow justifies the domination of the many by the few, by the ruling class. And a hegemony occurs when that ideology, that set of principles, becomes our own, and we start to filter the world through the filter of the dominant class. So we see the world in the way they see it, right? Which is very convenient for them, right? Because if we happen to look at it in a different way, for example, why does Jeff Bezos have all of that money and there, I don't know, 400,000 people sleeping on the streets of New York? Why should that be true? Why is it Jeff Bezos has all the money he has and that other clown, Elon Musk, they have all of that money, and the public schools in American cities are falling apart, right? I mean, these are questions you can ask, and one would ask, but it's very difficult to ask them because most Americans, to focus on the United States for a moment, and I apologize for that, it's certainly true of Canada as well, but you see it with greater clarity in the United States because capitalism is so proud and outspoken. So you can see it there. So that's what hegemony is. It's when the ideology of the ruling class becomes a dominant form of thought for everyone, right? Because then you don't have to beat people up. They somehow manage to incorporate the kind of, how should I put it? If the ruling class wants to put you in a kind of box, it through ideology is the box, and ideology becomes hegemony when you step inside the box and you think inside the box. That's not a bad way to think of it. You're thinking, if you're in a world of hegemony, you're thinking in the box of the ruling class without being aware of it. So that's why in critical social theory, there's such attention paid to these two notions. Gramsci, by the way, was the individual who focused a great deal on culture and hegemony. The term hegemony is his. Hegemon in ancient Greek is a leader, by the way. It's interesting to keep that in mind. Gramsci, by the way, and I don't mean to go on about radicals here, but Gramsci, you should know, was also interested in transforming the world. He was not a reformer, he was a transformer. He was the head, the president, the head of the Italian Communist Party. He was one of the few brave voices raised in opposition to the Mussolini government, which then imprisoned him. He spent 10 years in prison and died there. After writing something called the Prison Notebooks, which stands, I think, as one of the great political texts of the 20th century, I think by wide acclaim. I think even scholars who are opposed to the Marxist tradition would look at Gramsci as someone who has very important things to say about modern society, including, by the way, on ideology and hegemony in particular. Social location, Dugan goes into social location as another feature of critical social theory. And I think we know what that means. If you have any difficulty with it, let me know, of course. Social location, I think, is more or less where you are positioned in society across a whole range of variables: gender, age. I hesitate to use race, ethnicity. Why do I hesitate to use race? And I hope I don't get attacked for this, but race is not a biological notion. It's an ideological notion. And it's very important to see that. Because so far as I know in biology, and I'm not a biologist, so I should be careful, but I believe the notion of race is not a biological term. It's not a term that biologists use, except in very superficial ways, right? It's not a core part of biological science at all. So it's important to keep that in mind. Now, I want to go to tools. I'm not sure how much time I have left. I want to go to tools, though, and talk about his tools. Dugan offers a number of interpretive tools. He has the tool of deconstruction. I'm sure you've heard of deconstruction. It was very, very popular for a while in the academy and in the world of academics. It still is in certain domains. Deconstruction is about taking theories apart, examining their assumptions, looking at the relationships of different parts of the idea, looking at power. There are a number of things that Dugan discusses that I think are appropriate. Certainly one of them would be the focus on I'm just trying to get the text here because I don't have my glasses. Give me a sec. Sorry about that. I still don't have my glasses because I can't find them. But he has on page 44 the tools of deconstruction. And he has flow of power as one of the categories. There are a number of them here. Take a look at the diagram, give it some thought. He talks about willful blindness, and I think we have some idea of what that is. In other words, I don't want to know. Commodification, again, I said about commodification, I think what he's really talking about is capitalism and some of the fundamental notions behind capitalism. He talks about, as I mentioned, flow of power. He also has tools of reconstruction in the chapter. And in fact, that brings an end to his chapter more or less. And the tools of reconstruction, the interesting thing is, he's wise to have them. Why do I say that? Because people like Derrida, out of that tradition, the deconstructionist tradition, they're not interested in reconstruction. I'm not sure they believe in it. I think they might consider that out of line, right, to construct, because as soon as you start constructing, you go astray. There is that element in the deconstructionist tradition. So it's not clear that you can reconstruct. This is an addition from Dugan, in my opinion. It's the idea that you'd have tools of reconstruction is Dugan. It's not deconstruction. If you look up Derrida and reconstruction, I don't think you find anything. Now, I could be wrong, but let me know if you do. So his tools of reconstruction, he talks about disrupting normativity. That's like brasser la cage, you shake the cage, you rock the boat, right? Attending to power, he talks about, and I think it's obvious why we would be attending to power. We're talking about an ideology. We're looking to deconstruct ideologies, and ideologies are expressions of power, right? Uh, that should be clear, because you're creating them in order to control a subordinate, subaltern population, a majority or a minority, right? So they're expressions of power. So when you're looking to critique an ideology, it's natural to, I think, include the notion of power. Building interest convergence is a tool of reconstruction. There's no doubt about it. I'm a little bit surprised that he doesn't touch on, this is an extemporaneous thought, meaning I'm having it right now. He doesn't touch on the discipline of change management at all, because often when you're looking at reconstruction, if reconstruction is happening after a transformation where you're more or less clearing the slate and then rebuilding, you need some approach to not managing, but leading the transformation and managing it, right? It's not clear that the deconstructionists would follow us down the road of reconstruction, because it's a different kind of paradigm. If that isn't clear to you, let me know. Now, I think I'm almost done. He talks about, and I find these terms a little bit troublesome, essential preparation for applying critical perspectives, page 49. He has metacognition. I'm not sure that's the right term for what he's thinking about, but it's about, it's related to, I believe, the second item, critical self-reflection, where, you're thinking about your own thoughts, right? You're reflecting on yourself and your thinking. Critical reflection is a fundamental task of leadership, I would say. Now, I just threw that out, but if you know Peter Senge, he's a major management and leadership theorist who says that he has something called, it's the 5 disciplines of leadership or something. I'll have to check it to be certain of the reference. But he talks about self-mastery as, in a sense, the fundamental step in managing change and transformation. The change is outside you, but it needs to have a reflection inside you. So he talks at length about the mastery, self-mastery. It's called the 5th discipline, the book. I'm just such a, I don't know, forgetful person. I couldn't remember it on the spot. It's called the 5th discipline. If you ever get a chance, take a look. Social perspective taking the perspective of others is, of course, very important. There's a term for it in German called Verstand. And Verstand is about learning and knowing through conversation, through connection with others. It can be argued it's very important to the social sciences, to understanding in the social sciences. Dialectical thinking, this is how I would put that. The concept of leadership, for example, is a dialectical concept. What do I mean by that? I mean that it has a history, and over time, the shape of the idea evolves. So it's in a perpetual evolution, the idea of it has its own dialectic. It unfolds over time. It becomes a richer idea. Another example of this is the notion of freedom, right? Our conception of freedom in 1750 was very different from our conception of freedom in 1850, which in turn is quite different from our conception of freedom in, say, 1950 or 2050, right? These ideas evolve over time, unlike ideas in the natural sciences, right? Like mass. Well, the equation, force equals mass time acceleration from Newton. It's those terms are fixed. There's a debate in the philosophy of science about this. I should be careful, but they're fixed in the sense that mass is mass. You don't come to the table with, oh, I have a new conception of mass. No, we all accept that there's a concept of mass, right? We're not, as I said in the first talk, we're not in that world, right? Our notions are not fixed in that way. So they're elastic, they're unbounded, right? They have no exact edge, right? You could call them, the logicians would call them fuzzy ideas. But they're fuzzy because they're quite rich. I wanted to say critical hope, I thought, was an interesting idea. Gramsci talks about the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will, right? And the thing about Gramsci is, as I said earlier, Gramsci was a transformer. He sought to transform the world, not to reform. And I would argue that where do we need to go ourselves? Now, this is a very bold claim, so take it with an extraordinary grain of salt. But where are we going? We're trying to transform the world. The current structures in place are not able to handle the reality that we face. If you want to see an example of what I mean, look at climate change, but don't just look at it and don't just read about it. Go to someone like Steve Keen, Keen. You can find him on YouTube. He's an economist. He's very bright, very capable mathematician. And he talks about climate change, but he talks about it in a very different way from the way in which the mainstream media talks about it. Now, why would the mainstream media take such a different line? Think ideology. Do we really think that the major oil companies want a world in which we're no longer burning fossil fuels and all of the allied industries, all of that power, that economic power? Do we think they want, a world of windmills and solar panels? No, they have an entrenched interest to see that we continue burning fossil fuels, and we all think that it's quite consistent with the future of the human species. Now, if you look at Keen, you look at Steve Keen, Keen will give you a much better picture of the possible, if not probable, if not quite probable, consequences of climate change. And they're nothing like what you hear in the mainstream. What you hear in the mainstream, and I could give you specific examples, I won't. What you hear in the mainstream is, the temperature is going to go up a degree. Big deal. Like, is that a problem? That's not a problem. Well, that's not how it works. You need to bring your systems thinking to the environment. And when you do, and I did a little work in the Meteorological Service of Canada, when you do, you will find that the consequences, the 1 degree rise in temperature, that's not on the right scale at all. What we're looking at, to be honest, and again, I don't claim to know the science in detail, but what we're looking at is a world, a future, in which the cells, these are meteorological cells that control massive movements of air from the equator to 30 degrees, from 30 to 60, from 60 to 90. There are 3 cells that control the movement of large air masses. And there is a serious risk, according to the scientific experts, that those cells could break down. If they break down, what you could see is a desert from the American border all the way to the American border south. So what you would have is a desert. and think of the millions of people who live in that area. Think of the consequences. My point about climate change is the mainstream media dominates the picture of it. And so we get a very anodyne picture. It's a very soft picture of something that could be absolutely cataclysmic. And here we are kind of sitting in the corner, having our drinks, puffing on our cigarettes, thinking, oh, no, it's temperature's going to go up maybe a degree, maybe a degree and a half. It's going to be better in Quebec City. It's going to be a bit warmer there. Whatever. It's insane, but there are many, many examples of this. They're not hard to find. So again, back to ideology. So you have a ruling class, and we have one, and they have an ideology. And the ideology says it's well and good that we're in charge and you're not, right? It's because you're not capable. We're the leaders, right? We're elites. The term prominent Canadians is thrown around all of the time by the government of Canada. It makes me ill. But that's the idea. They're just some prominent people who more or less should be in charge because it's just more or less a natural result of things that they are in charge. Well, that's what they want us to believe, right? So that's ideology, and hegemony is when we take it inside and adopt it as our own set of spectacles on the world. If you think about it, that's a much better way of managing a governed population, a ruled population, than having to resort to violence, right? Instead of going out and meeting people with, police and water cannons and the rest, well, we can just try to convince people that this order that we see is natural. It's the way things should be. So it's fascinating. We could go on about this topic for a long time. But I'll leave it at that for now. And I hope that this has been useful for you. If you have any questions, let me know. And we'll take it from there. And again, I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to use the technology still. So bear with me. Any other questions on Dugan, let me know. And good, we'll take it from there. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. Bye.